I'm going to talk a little bit about using the NetBeans Debugger with PHP. And hey, my name is Beck White. I'm a senior engineer at Palantir.net over in Chicago. And I actually gave this presentation internally at Palantir a couple weeks ago, and I figured I would share it with you all. So you're probably already debugging. Like, debugging is a thing we do. However, a debugger is not just you sitting at the keyboard. There's also a tool called a debugger that can help you step through code and examine it while it's running. So you want to use a debugger other than you sitting at the keyboard. If you find yourself dropping lots of DPM statements into your code, or when you're reloading and like re-entering your input and trying to figure out how a particular piece of code is like why it's responding differently to when it's supposed to respond the same, or why it's responding the same when it's not responding differently, what is happening? I'm reloading a million times, and I'm really sick of it. So I use a Mac. This presentation, I'm going to talk about MAMP, because that's kind of a lowest common denominator. Personally, I'm shifting towards a Vagrant-based development stack. So I'll be running like a LAMP stack on a Vagrant box on my machine. But MAMP is a great place to start because it comes with Xdebug installed. And you might already have it. If you're running another LAMP stack, it's pretty much the same setup. It's not materially different. You just have to make sure that Xdebug is installed for your PHP. Xdebug is the PHP debugger. It's a PHP extension. I don't know a whole lot about installing it if it doesn't already come installed. We could work it out together. And NetBeans is an IDE. Maybe you use an IDE, maybe you don't. It's an integrated development environment. That means it provides a lot of tools for development in one place. This is a good thing. It's also a bad thing. It makes for a fairly heavyweight editing experience. I get sick of a tool that doesn't respond to my typing like immediately. So I don't use an IDE for most of my development, or a traditional IDE. But I do use it when I need to debug. And of all the things I learned in my college C++ class, using an IDE and using a debugger in an IDE, that was like the takeaway. Because, I mean, you can learn for loops in your spare time. But I'm not going to open up an IDE unless somebody makes me, or unless I want to debug. So it's pretty simple to set this up. You add a line to your php.ini. In MAMP, just make sure you check the preferences to find out what version of PHP you're running, so that you can edit the correct php.ini file. And after you save the file, you have to restart MAMP. This is the same if you're running PHP in another environment. Make sure you edit your correct php.ini file, and make sure you restart Apache after. NetBeans, there are two levels at which you configure debugging. You configure at the application level, and you configure at the project level. And then you're ready to go. I'm going to walk you through this actually in the debugger momentarily. That's why I'm kind of jumping through this. But I just want to introduce one major concept. I guess the plural concepts is a bit of a misnomer here, because the only thing I really care about is breakpoints. This is kind of the main operating idea of using a debugger, at least in Drupal and NetBeans and Xdebug, because this is the most reliable part of it. It's basically a point in the code that you want to examine. What kinds of things can you find out by examining code, by setting a breakpoint? You can figure out whether a conditional is executing. How many times is this loop going through? Is the stuff in this if statement actually getting run? Just put a breakpoint there. you'll see. What values do variables have at this point? Why isn't my form state looking the way I expect it to? Where can I actually find this form value? Like, Drupal has these arrays of doom. Dig in. The one caution, though, is if the array is too big, sometimes the DPM is actually more effective because you can crash NetBeans. Thanks, Drupal. If you want to know where a piece of code is called from, say there's a function that keeps getting called. You're like, why is this getting called today? Like, it's only supposed to be called on Tuesdays, and today is a Saturday. Who's calling it? So you can look back at kind of the call stack, like, well, you know, my mom called me, and my dad called my mom, and my aunt called my dad. And so ultimately, my aunt is responsible. That's where the bug is. You can also figure out what gets called next. Where does this data go? How does the things that I'm changing right now, what's the next step? So you step over into and out of loops, functions, methods. And you probably weren't taking notes. There's a Google Doc. If you follow me on Twitter, I just tweeted. My Twitter handle is @BeckW. And these slides are linked. And so that document has everything I just said in so much more detail.
What is it? BeckW?
Yeah.
Like BECW?
Yes. I wonder if I put that on my first slide. Yes. So that link actually goes to this document. There's a table of contents. It goes in depth. And I have some screenshots about setting it up. I already have it set up on my machine. Like I mentioned, with MAMP, you can configure your PHP version in the preferences. And MAMP will use a different php.ini file depending on what PHP version is in use. So make sure you edit the right one. I'm actually going to open this up. Let's see. So I'm in my MAMP. The php.ini files in MAMP are under the bin directory. So if you go to /application/MAMP, they're actually in the bin, which is weird to me because there are also duplicate ini files elsewhere. Just use the ones in the bin under PHP. And I'm running PHP 5.4. So here in my ini file, at the very end of the file, there's a section that says xdebug. And if you have not yet configured xdebug, these lines will just have a semicolon in front of them. They'll be commented out. So all you have to do is uncomment them. It's very, very straightforward. And then you restart MAMP. There are a couple of flags here. And if those aren't in your php.ini, you may want to add them. You probably want to add them. But I think all the necessary ones are already present.
Should we so like looking at my php.ini file, it's not through MAMP, but there's a whole bunch of xdebug options that are commented out at the end of the php.ini file. Is it safe to just uncomment them all?
Yes, because they'll be their default values. I'm fairly sure. And if they vary from these values, I would try these values first. So the next step is to configure NetBeans. And so you have to configure, like I said, at both the application level and the project level. So I'm actually going to switch over to NetBeans and check this out. In my preferences, PHP, debugging. And so this lets you set the debugger port and the session ID. I think that that matches this xdebug remote port equals 9,000. So those two ports should match. The other thing you need to do is you need to configure debugging for your specific project, which I haven't done yet. I have this project called Alice. It's a Drupal website with each of the chapters from Alice in Wonderland. And so in my project, I actually, in the project sidebar, I can control click here and set the configuration. So what I actually have to do here is change my web root. When I set up a project in NetBeans, or a Drupal project in general, I have a directory that's the project directory. And then within that, there's a www that is the web root. And so I want to make sure that when NetBeans is running the debugger, it knows that it's running over that www rather than over somewhere else. Like that's where the browsers, or that's where the information is going to, the code is going to run. So I have to change this web root to www. And is there anything else I need to do? I have to make sure there's a project URL. So under the run configuration, I run it as a local website. And then I set the project URL. So if I put this URL in the browser, I should go to the root level of the site. So I'm going to do that right now. And there is, slowly but surely, my Drupal homepage. Hey, there's some Alice in Wonderland. So now that I have that set up, I can put the index file here. I don't need to because it does it by default, but I save it. And now we're ready to roll. So the next thing that we want to do is actually set a breakpoint so that we can look at some code in action. And I have downloaded the examples module from Drupal.org. If you haven't seen the examples module, it can be kind of handy. It has a ton of different things that you can do in Drupal. Batches, Ajax, form, like random stuff, BBTNG, all of it. It's pretty handy. So I have the form example module open, and there's a multi-step form. It's right here. So it's example number 8. So there's a next button. I can enter a next some information and hit next. And hey, there's another page. Where did that information that I just entered go? Like, do I still have access to that? I don't know. I can go into the code and say, here is form example 8. And here it's saying, you know, there's some things and you submit it. And then there's I could put some DPMs in here, you know. I could say, oh, here's the page 2 example. I could say, let's DPM form state, you know. And then if every time I want to see the answer there, let's see. Oh, here, I can look into my form state. I feel fantastic. I have used a DPM. But you know, that might not give me all the information that I need. So instead, I could put a breakpoint. And then what I do is I run the project. In NetBeans, when you have it open, there's a bunch of buttons in the top toolbar. If you don't have those buttons, the most important ones are this little line one. If you look at the icon really closely, there's like a breakpoint and a play button. It says debug project if you hover over it. That one's really important because that's how you start the debugger. And then there's a couple of grayed out buttons here, which are only active when we're debugging. And like I said, if those aren't present, you can control click on that toolbar and enable run and debug. And then also down here, there are 3 little tabs. There are a whole bunch more debugging tabs. These are the ones I actually use. They say breakpoints, call stack, and variables. I mentioned each of these things in that quick presentation earlier. Breakpoints is actually a list of the breakpoints I have set in my project. So, well, or in any project. Let's delete that. So I have 1 breakpoint set right now. Like you said, or like you just saw, I can disable or delete breakpoints here. So if I want to run the project without actually stopping, but I just want to leave it in place, I can disable it. It's still there. If I double click on it, it will take me to it. So if I scroll off it, I can navigate to any breakpoint really easily. It's kind of like a bookmark in that way. Call stack, it doesn't show anything right now, and neither does variables. So I'm going to hit run. And what's going to happen is I'm going to get a browser window. And this browser window is going to take me to the front page of my website. And everything looks normal. NetBeans didn't do anything. But you know what happened is that code doesn't run on this page. So it's not going to hit the breakpoint on this page because that form isn't there. So if we go over to this form page, and I'm actually just going to reload it. It looks like it's hung, doesn't it? What's happening? Oh, it loaded? Let's enter something.
Oh, does debugging slow down quite a bit? Enabling debugging?
You know what should be happening here is it should be stopping at the, what is supposed to happen and what's not happening is that when it hits this point in the code, NetBeans is going to wake up and this is going to turn green. And that web page is just going to keep loading and loading and loading because execution is paused. NetBeans is actually stopped, like, actually not NetBeans, but Xdebug has stopped the script at that exact point and has told NetBeans, hey, this is where I am. Here's your context about where I am. Ask me anything. Check it out. Tell me what to do next. But let's see if we can make that work. I am going to put a breakpoint on page 1. And I'm going to reload. There we go. So I'm going to switch back to my browser. It's still loading. It's still loading. But we're paused here. So if you're not paying attention and you forget you're debugging, sometimes you'll get to your page like that, and it'll be loading and loading. You're like, what is going on? And you'll switch back to NetBeans and be like, oh, NetBeans is waiting for me to tell it to go. So here we are. You'll notice there's stuff in the variables place. So I can look in my form state here and see what's up. I can look in my form. That's an empty array. It says it right there. And then I can also look at the superglobals. And if I'm done, if I have all the information I need, all I needed to do was say, look at something in the form state, I can hit play, and it's just going to go right through. NetBeans is done. My page is loaded. OK, we're good. But say that I want to, I'm going to reload again so that we can get back to this breakpoint. There we go. Say that we want a little more information. I don't know whether the stuff in this is actually going to run, the stuff inside of this conditional that we're looking at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step over. And that's this little button here. If you hover over it, it says step over. And what this is going to do is it's going to go to the next line of code that's going to execute. So you'll notice it skipped right over that if statement. And I can go to the next one, just line by line. Step right through. What is going to happen next? And here I'm at the end of the function. I can see what's going to happen next. Oh, we're going to go up into Drupal, a part of Drupal I never wanted to see. I'm just going to let it keep playing.
How would NetBeans respond if there was a problem in your code?
A problem in my code? If there's an error, like an error that would prevent the code from running normally, NetBeans wouldn't even get there. So the PHP script wouldn't compile. It wouldn't be valid PHP. So you wouldn't even be able to debug there.
Can you trigger it to stop, like when a variable changes a value or anything like that?
There is a functionality called watch, which allows you to enter a simple PHP expression. And so anytime you hit a breakpoint, that expression is evaluated. So you can run a function in there, compare a variable, something like this.
But you'd have to set a breakpoint as opposed to like a trace?
Correct. So, but the thing about watch is I found that it's fairly unstable. It's a good way for me to crash my NetBeans setup. So I avoid it.
So you use NetBeans in place of watch? Is that what you do?
No.
There's, let's see, debug,
Like a function within the debug.
new watch. So I can say, and that's always going to return false, obviously.
I don't know. Might drop a bit. And then
So here we have the watch statement and the value.
doesn't overflow.
So you can see it's like 0 over there.
Okay.
So I think for simple things, yes. For complicated things, it evaluates it every single step. So.
Is there like a trace where you can see the execution, but watch for a variable and see it change or something like that? Or
Not necessarily.
Because the problem with like data structures and stuff is you might have it within the value of something else. So if you clear the overall structure, it's clearing that field, but it's not really referencing that field. So if you could watch it and see where the value might change, it might be in a place that you're not even expecting it.
Yeah, and that's the point where you follow the execution path through. So I can actually also step out of this function. So say I'm sure this form function is fine. So I'm going to hop up to whatever called it and press that up. And we can see kind of the call stack. So that's another thing we have is who called a particular function, which does help with that also. So you can step up to where it was called from. But again, I don't particularly want to delve into the depths of FAPI right now.
Because the watch will just check it at that point that you're in the program. Correct?
Yep, that's correct. So I think that's everything that I generally use with the debugger. I use it to see where my function is or method is getting called from, and I use it to see what's next and verify that particular loops are getting executed and check the values of variables when a loop isn't executed, when a conditional is not working as I expect. Do you have more questions? Is there anybody?
I'd be curious. So I opened up NetBeans here, and I mean, just whenever we're done, I'd love to like. I can't figure out here how to like connect it to like I have a sandbox project running locally.
Okay. Well, I think we're done. Let's sit down and look at it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.